Hello everyone, we'll start in a few seconds just while everyone orientates themselves and gets prepared for today's session. We're going to be covering Transnational Security Risk Management. So I'll just let everyone get themselves organised, be prepared. We're going to start in a few seconds whilst everyone gets themselves seated in a quiet place or prepares for today's training session, which will go for approximately 60 minutes, starting from the moment that you heard my voice. So everyone should be organised and prepared, had an opportunity to test their volumes and their screen resolutions, and possibly block out any exterior noises or distractions for the period of this session in preparation for what we're going to cover as part of the extended and continuous learning programs in security and risk management. So as I said, this session is going to cover transnational security risk management, which is particularly applicable for those with a multinational or international environment where they're going from different jurisdictions, different countries, different locations, either as a holistic view or as they set up, regulate or manage operations and businesses in different locations. So, by way of introduction, my name's Tony Ridley. I'll be the speaker and the host for this session today. Just touching on a few of my experiences. So I'm a career security risk management professional with over 30 years experience in both government and commercial sector. Some recent experiences as a security subject matter expert in a $12 billion legal dispute on an international matter. Previously, I've managed and coordinated up to 3,500 security guards across 50 different projects in an international environment. I have a number of formal qualifications, diplomas, certificates, certifications and so on, and I'm currently undertaking a master's degree in security and risk management through one of the internationally accredited and renowned universities. So a lot of this I'm going to also draw from over 200 transnational international consulting projects and tasks that I've completed to date, some of those previously mentioned, as well as prior experience as the Regional Security Director for a large multinational assistance company. And I've had quite a lot of direct and indirect and oversight responsibility for operations relating to terrorism attacks, risk assessments, operations reviews, and even internal and corporate activities. I'm also the founder and CEO of a transnational safety and risk management consulting business, which has conducted over 600,000 assessments to date and counting. And as many of you, either in the early days or at some point in your careers, I have origins within the military, within special operations, having served 11 years in the SAS, the Special Air Service Regiment, before transitioning into a commercial career. So I'm going to touch on a number of related issues based on my own experience as well as through the formation of the industry itself, and then go into sort of more detail in various areas and subjects that are specific and pertinent to both the task and also the industry. So without any further ado, let's get into it. So a number of things that I want to cover off that are often overlooked or individuals and organisations fail to establish a number of benchmarks. And in particular, I want to touch on a few things such as infrastructure. It's important to have baseline comparable elements between both your own core experiences and your own culture and your own environment to then compare against international or transnational standards. I don't recommend, and it's highly recommended by numerous experts, simply just leaping into an international environment and assuming or making too many assumptions in relation to how you think or how you would like certain things to take place. It's important to establish a number of baseline elements that are both transferable and identifiable and even universal, that you can go, okay, well, in this particular environment, this is how it works. This is how it interacts with the environment. This is how it impacts my organisation as well as the security environment. And therefore, it is an essential element of transnational security risk management. As well as a number of influences, and I'll talk about some of the social sciences, I'll talk about the psychology of certain elements, as well as society and political influences that essentially when we do the evaluation of risk, it's a very value-laden process. That is that we bring our own assumptions, our own beliefs, our own education experiences, and we try and view specific elements both through our own lens, but also objectively in the context of the organisation, what is best for the organisation, particularly if we're trying to reduce some of those influences. But equally, we need to accommodate or include some of those local nuances. And unfortunately, in many instances, they're either not declared or they're not considered, or they're simply not made on an empirical or comparative basis between what we believe to be high or low quality and that of what is available locally. I'll touch on some of the major issues. As you can well appreciate, when it comes to both infrastructure and influence, they can also play significant roles when it comes to major issues themselves. But I'll highlight some specific issues that I wish I had have known or I had have been aware of in the early stages, or those things that have repeated consistently throughout the course of both my experience and career, but also that you'll see appear quite regularly when it comes to running or overseeing security and risk management in an international setting. And then I'll talk about some of the results and some of the requirements that individuals or organisations should be looking for, because again, this plays back to the earlier references of both infrastructure and influence, is that a single flawed approach is trying to imprint particularly from those cultures, organisations and individuals that believe or espouse to have a more evolved, or dare I say it, superior approach, is then trying to make those demands or trying to project onto organisations, individuals, communities and societies without both consideration for all of the aforementioned elements, but at the same time understanding change management plays a fundamental role here as well. And therefore it may take time, there may be a series of milestones that need to be achieved, but most importantly, it's something that you need to be aware of before you either confirm or assure or even guarantee certain outcomes, because it is most definitely going to be influenced. And if you set a false expectation or you set false standards, then not only is it a recipe for yourself not to be in that role very long, but it also frustrates both the parties involved, but certainly puts organisations and processes at risk as well. So let's talk about some of the influences, and let's start with some of the big ticket items. Those are the things that really from the very beginning you should be considering. And the first one is culture. And as I said earlier, it's not just a case of your own culture and your own beliefs, but others. And there's a couple of fundamental things that you should be able to do. And one is make an empirical comparison between your beliefs and systems and processes and that of others. So what I mean by that is there's significant research and resources that compare apples with apples, not apples and oranges, not some other weird abstract process, because if you don't define both the culture, and that relates to both internal and external, and you don't make quantitative comparisons, then you not only have you made some significant assumptions that will taint all of your assessments, all of your management processes, but certainly your results. But what you've also done is you've invited or introduced a layer of confusion between yourself and that of second and third party representatives. So what I mean by that is that if you hand over your results to somebody else, whether they be a manager, whether they be someone else in the organisation, or even local resources and assets, if you haven't clearly defined your assumptions, and in particular culture, then they are fundamentally working from a flawed or an incomplete plan. So therefore, you have to define it. Now, you can use visuals, you can use empirical evidence, you can use quantitative data, you can use a whole host of elements that are applicable to both the task and the environment to make sure that you do that. But it's essential that you define and quantify and qualify culture before you then start to move into the process. Because if you start to try and force a different culture or a different concept and understanding into a culture that is both resistant to change or simply unaware of all of the elements that go with it, not only will be met with frustration and likely failure, but it is going to become very, very apparent that it just does not fit in. And if it doesn't fit in, it's going to have obvious wear and tear, but it's also elevates the probability of failure, but it's just being too costly or too difficult to maintain. So if we do a bit of a sort of a global wander based on some of the travels and experiences that I've had in recent years, I sort of like to collect a local environment sort of pictures to depict a security concept from one environment to another that is relatively consistent. And what I mean here is the public and emergency or even police services response, and security is a commercial and both private and public approach, is their approach to public barricades or segmenting traffic, because as we have seen, there have been both deliberate and accidental use of vehicles to both interact and attack and even kill individuals. So a lot of cities have evolved without that consideration, and traffic and public transport interact very close to pedestrian sidewalk and foot traffic. So how have retrospectively or retroactively organisations and the security industry, as both public and private, sought to achieve both this separation or simply stop some of these attacks? So let's look at Melbourne to begin with. So you can see the use of industrial or roadside work barricades. Now, the ones in the top right corner, as many of you will be familiar, were originally designed to be filled with sand or water. And in this instance, they're empty. Now, they do create an interlocking barrier. They do slow down traffic, but to a large degree, it's largely visual. And as you can see, as that sort of progressed, there's large concrete blocks. Yes, they're difficult to move, but what an eyesore that they have created in terms of not being finished. They're a hastily applied solution. And, to a large degree, the reason that has been so hasty and largely an eyesore and so ugly is because at some point somebody said no. Somebody said, no, there's not a more refined approach. No, we're not approving the budget. No, we don't believe it's a risk. So these measures were introduced hastily and they really stand out. They're an obvious measure, both for practitioners and for those looking to avoid security measures. You can see where the security measures are because they're so ugly and they're so prominent. And that's not a qualitative sort of statement. It's if a lot of what we do in the security space is so obvious, yes, it can work as a deterrent, but it also then aids for those more professional or those more concerted efforts to know, well, that's how I get around it. This is just another thing I need to plan for or get around. And they've made it nice and easy for me to identify what it is, where it is, and possibly how to get around it. But most importantly, the community and society reject these sorts of these measures. And in these instances, they've caused a lot of conflict and a lot of diminishment of security as a profession, because they look at that and they go, well, any tradesperson could have come up with that idea and just plonked that down. Really? You call that expertise? Not really. Next, we'll look at New York. And in New York, and as you can appreciate, particularly in the wake of current presidential appointees who originate from New York and have real estate holdings, again, you can see a different way in which it was approached. And you can see it's become part of the landscape. There are certain elements that simply don't stand out as security measures. They've just become, over time, for different reasons, at different stages, more evolved, more aesthetic, more ingrained. Because, again, at some point, somebody said yes, or they appreciated that the risk or the threat was significant enough to approve both the measures but a particular approach that fitted in with the culture. Now, having said that, you can scratch the ugly underbelly, so to speak, and you can still find eyesores, you can still find temporary elements, and you can still find measures that don't brand both an organisation and security in a very good light when you see this sort of security rubbish lying around to a degree. But for all intents and purposes, a lot of security measures are now blended into the landscape, so they become less identifiable, but they're also more palatable, because again, one of the key features as we talk about certainly things like crime prevention through environmental design, we want to design in lifestyle. We don't want to design out the sheer living factor. And we don't want to make these prison type environments that nobody wants to go to and no one frequents, or they're simply just glorified prisons that reflect almost a military doctrine upon individuals, because A, not only is that met with resistance, but B, if people and commerce don't come to those locations, they go somewhere else, and then all we're doing is through a process of displacement, causing a problem or consideration somewhere else, and we've wasted all these money, all this resource and time in the first place. So if we then go to France, and in this instance, if we look at Paris, there's a combination. There's a combination of certain elements that, you know, for all intents and purposes, they stand out in the landscape and individuals can immediately identify. Some of these are actually quite cleverly concealed because individuals are using them to stand up on blocks and take selfies and interact with their environment. So even though it doesn't necessarily match the landscape, they're not necessarily as overt. And they're certainly very consistent in terms of how it's accepted by both the local culture, and in this instance, a lot of volume of tourists and foreigners come through as well. So they don't feel like it's a threatening environment. But if we compare with the top left, and we can see the police emergency services, again, that can be quite confronting, that can be different. I'm not saying it's certainly not necessary, but again, it's consistent with the culture. So we have a benchmark, or we have a baseline that we can make comparisons. So if we would introduce something that is well outside of that cultural backdrop, that cultural acceptance, the legitimacy of the practices that we profess, then it would not only be an eyesore, but at the same time, it would quickly be opposed by many representatives, both state and non-state state actors, but it would also probably either accelerate its relocation or dismissal, or outright rejection. In the bottom left, that you can see again a more subtle sort of the dragon's teeth approach, which originated from sort of excuse me, anti-tank type traverse elements from military purposes. But again, you can see it's quite discreet. It's also quite good for controlling traffic, but it acts as a means of a barrier and delineation between foot traffic, individuals, and achieves the aesthetic. The problem that we all face, particularly with the modern digital technology base, is there are just some things that are obviously going to stand out, particularly with the backdrop of historical venues and so on. There are many clever and aesthetic ways of integrating them, but sometimes there's just no hiding the fact that we're dealing sometimes with the past and the obvious future. There needs to be an integration or consideration for both, and no more prevalent is this when you put it in these sorts of public environments. And just quickly wrapping up a couple of other locations. So if we look at Nice, for example, again, unobtrusive, it achieves the same objective. In some instances, they've been turned into sort of art forms, temporary elements, or they're concealable and movable. So they retract into the ground, or they're spherical. They're not sort of hard, crass, isometric shapes. And again, thousands of people back and forth every day. Many people simply do not identify them as actual security measures, but for the keen individual or public and private security practitioner, it's immediately apparent. But again, it's all about the integration. You're not trying to force or project something that is quickly both going to be rejected, but is simply inappropriate. What it also does is allow for consideration of alternate methods. there are often too many individuals or practitioners that focus on their own way of doing things and don't consider what that might be from other contexts or other environments, because it may well work. Your gaze has just been too narrow. And then lastly, we'll just look at London. So, for example, again, it's a very cultural response, a very cultural approach. There's been, in the top left, you can see efforts to sort of conceal or blend in or soften some of these measures. It's still exactly the same, and some of these measures have been in place for decades, if not centuries. But under the top right there, you can see major obstructions that do the job, and they're linked together, but they really do stand out. And from someone who's a visitor, or someone who is, or major commerce is derived from tourism and visitors, those sorts of things both raise an eyebrow or simply stand out as, well, is there something I'm missing, or should I be concerned? And it can create a degree of dread or fear within a community, both locally and internationally, that perhaps is either overstated or is not necessarily commensurate with the everyday risk or threat. So I just wanted to highlight those in terms of visuals that you can go back to and have a look and you go, okay, well, these are different cultural approaches, and see what sort of stands out, what blends in, because there's a lot more than some of these barricades in these images. There's layers upon some of these considerations. And as I said, some are recent, some are timeless to a degree, but it's the reasons, justifications, and how they've been converged that one should consider. Now, I've spoken about the pride and the culture. Just excuse me while I take a drink of water. I've spoken about the pride and the culture. Now, these are two different elements too. It should never be dismissed or understated how much pride goes into local culture or local practices, because, again, if you try to impose a change or something that really is, it's called cognitive dissonance from a psychological background. That is, that you're being affronted with something that goes totally against your values, your beliefs, your understanding, and your worldview of things. So not only, and it registers as pain in the brain, so it's almost the same as a physical assault, and for many it registers in the same sort of category and to the same degree. So if you affront or you offend somebody, then that pride factor is also going to play a role. Now, this could be represented by the communities, this can be represented by employees, even management, and even local governmental element or social service, emergency services, police, military, and so on. So be very careful of just jumping into what looks like a textbook response without considering both culture but also the audience's response. And I've categorised this very broadly as pride because, again, not only can it frustrate, but you may find that security measures or influences, the actual solution play second place to you now being the focus of your suggestion, of your egregious or your particularly dismissive approach to local pride and culture. Now, this plays a role with benchmarking. So we talk about the loss of liberties when we talk about public and private security. You know, what freedoms are we surrendering? What constraints are we now applying? What activities that were socially both are now criminally prohibited, or socially, they're deemed as criminogenic. That is that, it was previously acceptable, but we as a society don't want it. But it may or may not be against the law, or it may be varying levels of criminality. Things like parking tickets and speeding. Oh, well, yeah, people do it, but it's not necessarily as egregious or as viewed on the same scale as, say, murder or assault. So, again, we need to have a series of benchmarks. We need to be both qualitative and quantitative in our assessments, and we need to have not necessarily a universal, but a local context of exactly what we're talking about before and after security measures were made. Because there's nothing worse than simply making the assumption of, well, we need to do this, and then not measuring the results, not understanding the problem in advance, and then not measuring the outcomes or the changes afterwards. Because you can be very quickly disproven to say, well, hang on, you put in this and it's exactly the same level of problem. Now, there may be different layers of the problem or issue that need to be addressed, but if you don't have definitive benchmarks or an understanding or a baseline set of analytics, then you simply don't know which part was most effective or ineffective, or what worked and what didn't work. Now, this ties in with the economics of things, how, both micro and macro elements. And there's quite a lot of social sciences around economics, particularly, there's things like game theory and the law of the instrument, the law of unintended consequences. All of these elements need to be both considered, but at the same time, if you're in support or protective of a commercial enterprise, what financial impact are you having on the organisation? Are you overcapitalising? Are you undercapitalising? Have you fallen foul of sunk costs that are not recoverable later on? Are these operational capital costs? There's a whole host of financial considerations that need to go into both your decision making, as well as your considerance of things like social and political factors, as well as your own reasoning and rationale as well. There's no point spending $1 there's no point spending $1 million to protect a $1 threat, and equally you've got to question why a $1 solution is not applied to a $1 million risk that could prevent or mitigate or manage in this particular environment. So it's what I always refer to as the language of business. So there is the technical purist approach when it comes to security and risk management, but when it comes to business, you need to be speaking the same language, the same terms of reference, and it needs to be inclusive of both your practices, your assessments, and certainly your recommendations. So if you're not familiar with it, and I know a lot of people, particularly when they first start out, aren't, or they're undeveloped, then you really need to get better at it, but no more so than in an international environment where simply something that might be cheap and available in US dollars, for example, may be a month's salary in a developing second, third tier category sort of economic environment. And it just doesn't make sense. And then when you put in layers of maintenance and upkeeps and import taxes, it just becomes untenable. So again, it needs to be a consideration fact. Public opinion. This ties into what I was talking about in terms of the social aesthetics, your legitimacy in a public and commercial environment. And when I say public, this just could be second and third party state and non-state actors, people that walk past the design, people that interact with it. These can be things like turnstables, boom gates, security checkpoints, the uniforms, if you're using guards, if you're having weapons. There's a whole host of things that, again, need to be aligned or in preparation. So public opinion is both an influencer, but certainly something that needs to be managed and benchmarked before and after. And look, public opinion may need to be one of those things that needs to be influenced over time. The public net maybe need to be made more aware of an issue, the priority of threats need to be rationalised, or they need to focus on certain things because it's simply not spoken about, or they have the wrong message, or possibly it's even outdated. So these are the essential elements that need to be included. Desirability as well. You have to break down often in terms of how you convey your message from a security perspective is how well do you package it? Have you packaged or presented or identified the best solution that is appealing to your audience, not to you? It may make all the sense in the world to you as a practitioner and a professional say, well, this is what's required. But if you don't explain it, if you don't convey it, if you don't present it, if it's not received or consumed by your intended audience to the same level of priority, or you allow them to make their own interpretive decisions based on what you've put in front of them, you may find yourself either influenced, diverted, or even undermined because the desirability of the audience is different, if not higher than yourself. So be very, very careful of how you present ideas and solutions and processes, that your level of priority is commensurate with how it's going to be perceived and desired. And look, we all have to sell something, whether it's an opinion, whether it's an idea, a solution, or a process. A lot can be learned from the marketing process. Now, I'm not talking, the ugly underbelly side of sales and marketing, and ambulance chasing type approaches that we often associate with cheap and nasty, and many cultural nuances will pop into people's heads, whether it be used car salesmen or insurance salesmen, however you want to categorize it. We've all got personal experiences, but essentially your messaging needs to be appropriate. So whether you use neuro-linguistic processing or programming, whether you appeal to people's bias, you emphasize attribution systems, whether you play on certain psychological factors, you use visual triggers, the way and means in which you communicate, or different languages, tones, and so on, the difference between male and female presenting of ideas, all these things need to be considered, because not only do you need to give your best option the best chance of acceptance, but you need to make sure that you've presented it in the best manner, because all the reckoning and assessment and expertise in the world accounts for nothing if you can't get people to subscribe, buy in, or take ownership of the solution that they require, whether they need it or not. So it's essential and important that people understand it. Now, conversely, you need to be able to see through some of that as well. All too often in the security industry, there are people selling good and bad products. You need to know the difference, and you need to know the way that they're manipulating you to try and get you to perhaps buy something or invest in something you either don't need or isn't as much as a priority, or just doesn't work as well as they claim it to. Now, these are some of the essential benchmarkings. And when we talk about international and transnational, look at some of the travel and tourism elements, because this is where we get a good display or benchmarking between the interactions of local influences, local resources, and that of a foreigner's perspective. Are signs multinational? Is there public transport suited to foreigners? Now, there's no such thing as a foreign environment. It's the individual who is actually foreign. So in many locations, you may find that, tourists are complaining about certain things, but that location or destination was never designed for an international audience, whether it be sightseers or backpackers or Airbnb or just sort of business or retail travellers. Look at the infrastructure. See what's there. How well catered is an international focus? Because this may influence your security factors, because it may be very, very locally nuanced. So accepted standards, accepted infrastructure may be so organically local that it has no comparative international benchmark. So what this creates an issue for, when you've got human capital, that is people, when you've got international business, you may find that part of their capacity building that you have is across all business elements, not just from a security perspective. So financial elements may be underdeveloped. Accommodation may be underdeveloped. Transport may be underdeveloped. So there's all of these incremental and influential elements that either need to be addressed or considered long before, continuously as part of the security mechanism, because if you're operating in a transnational and your business is either the pioneering first step or middle of the road, or there's lots of international business in the location, the best way to identify and benchmark that is not from your own personal experience. Look around and see how well they cater for foreigners. How well do they cater for tourism? And measure those numbers, because you may find that infrastructure and routines and processes change due to economic tourism factors. If you look at some of those destinations early on that I showed you in terms of London, France, and so on, whenever there's a negative incident, particularly a headline-grabbing, exciting, exotic, extraordinary event such as terrorism, these are the first numbers to be affected. So you may also find that if those numbers are effective and they go up rapidly up or down, you may find there may be more or less money available for certain essential services. So it's a very, very good benchmark, almost a health check for a local environment if the circumstances change, monitor these numbers, because you may find that simple essential services that were being taken place before may no longer be prevalent, or the money has flowed out of the location, or there's a lot of empty hotels and infrastructure because people are too scared to go there. And I've spoken ad nauseum about the infrastructure, but infrastructure, and I'll talk about some of those key elements of things to look at, but these are hard physical structures because they're often a visual and economic means of establishing parity. That's to say, well, you can compare apples and apples by, well, what's the economy like, but also what's the airport like? What are the hotels like? What are the bridges like? What are the roads like? All those fixed structures that you're going to be used or are going to influence your organisation, because it's quite good to have at least half a dozen, because it's your constant benchmark on a 6 month, 12 month, 5, 10 year timeline to say, well, this is what it was like when we were first here. Has the circumstances changed? And you have definitive terms of reference to go, ooh, this is decreased. I can see a change in this infrastructure because these were my benchmarking elements. We need to be prepared to either take on greater acceptance, or conversely, you may see an influx in infrastructure, money flow into a particular location, which will ease the organisation's burden. But you may also find economy of scales to say, well, you know what? Lots of other businesses are considering this, and security as a ecosystem has improved, so therefore we don't have to bear all of the cost. The rule of law. This changes the world over. It's vital to understand and interpret and make comparisons between what is acceptable, illegal, frowned upon, and certainly enforceable. And this comes to the apparatus, whether it be the likes of the military and police, depending on how that's implemented, but equally the spirit of the law. What is criminal activity? What is declared as criminogenic? What is socially unacceptable? What is socially acceptable? And definitive specifics related to that. There's nothing worse than acting on rumour or assumptions or outdated expectations. Whether they be good or bad, you need to have definitive elements, because if you look at the world over, laws change regularly. And the laws that change the swiftest are the ones that outrage communities or politicians, or are forced a public policy surprise. And that is that they get rushed through because they've been given a certain amount of urgency. And if you're not aware of that, or the rules change and it may benefit or it may hinder you, you need to be aware of those particular changes. Particularly as you go from one environment to another, you can't become complacent. Basics of emergency services. So are there ambulances? How quick do they respond? What are their capabilities? Do they have emergency life support capabilities, support, training? Perhaps you need to invest. Perhaps you need to have on-site. What happens in the first 3 minutes? What happens in the golden hour? These are transferable, universal, international benchmark standards that you can say, well, in this location, this is how it works. This location, this is how it works, both locally and internationally, because you're going to have an expectation or a difference of standards between what is locally accepted and what is an international standard. And for example, you may find yourself in an environment where there's an ambulance and paramedics that service, say, a population of 15 to 20,000 people. Whereas on your site, because you've got a remote site, you may have a dozen people who are trained to paramedic standard, advanced CPR capabilities, first aid. You have a much higher concentration of medical and emergency response capability than entire cities. So again, it's good to both understand, but also be appreciative of the fact that those sorts of things can also cause friction or be part of your security consideration, because at some point in a social community environment, people might start to look at and go, well, why have you got better than we do? We are the local community. We want some of that. Standards of care, again, quantitative aspects. Be very careful of making sure that this is an objective, non-biased approach. I won't say it's impossible, but you need to make sure that it is, again, commensurate with your systems that identify the essentials without being overly judgmental or, again, putting unrealistic expectations or expecting things, miracles that simply don't happen in this part or that part of the world. And the cost. I spoke about the economics before. Again, simple things. What some cultures take for granted, such as technologies, shoes, fashion wear, can be items of extreme value and wealth in some economies, and you may find yourself being liberated of those or being targeted by petty criminals and crime just because what you have in your hand is a year's wages or a month's wages. You need to put these things into context, as well as cash, as well as international commerce. And standards plays into this. What local standards, international, industrial standards, security standards, what are you going to select and apply, and what is relevant? Because at some point in a local environment, in international and regional, you are going to have to make either trade-offs, considerations, or aspirations to move towards a particular standard. And these things may not happen overnight. They may be objective standards that are used in the industry or international, or they could be standards that are made up by your organisation or you yourself to say, well, this is the acceptable minimum or maximum standard that we will tolerate. This is what we need to move to. And this is a very much appropriate to multinationals and internationals, because what you don't want to have is a disparity or a prejudiced culture that says, well, we don't do it that way in that location because it's X, Y, and Z, but this is how we do it in this particular environment. It invites problems, it invites frictions, and it certainly invites failure. To that end, communications, how it all plays together, how you communicate, whether it be technical, non-technical, and I won't go into too much. This should be fairly straightforward, and no sooner have I made this presentation or education, I can guarantee you there's going to be new technology that emerges, changes, is going to become relevant. You need to be cognizant of it. You need to be realistic, and you need to look into it. Religion, as they say, so many wars and frustrations and conflict have been fought on religion, a lack of understanding, a lack of acceptance. Call it what you will. Be very, very aware and inclusive of how religion sits on the landscape in a non-judgment evaluation, because it's an influencing factor, because it's part of people's core moral compass and their own DNA. It's going to affect everything that I've said before. And this also plays into things like language, what communications, lingua franca. Are there different caste systems in terms of certain echelons speak in a particular language and communicate in a certain way? Are you culturally appropriate? Do you fit in? Or is your vocabulary and your approaches outdated? Or are you being dogmatic and autocratic in how you communicate, which is both offensive and rejected, and therefore not achieving the aim? Simple things like airline routes, it seems kind of routine and pedestrian, but how frequent and how available are communication nodes, but also airlines, because again, it follows the money. And if there's an increase in interest and investment, then you'll see these changes. If all of a sudden you see a decline in airlines or servicing a particular destination, then again, it can be a precursor to an economic change, which could be good and bad for your environment. The ease of doing business, what are the enablers and inhibitors when it comes down to these sorts of things? Far too often security professionals fail to consider the business context. I'm not suggesting you go out and get an MBA. It can be useful, but it is not the only solution. But you need to understand and speak to the business, because at the end of the day, value creation and business enabling is your raison d'etre, it's your reason for existence. And if you can't help the business conduct their operations, then both you become obsolete, but at the same time, you need to understand what are the friction points and challenges of doing business in these sorts of environment or that particular environment. Airports, just quickly, I'll go through some of these because they should be self-explanatory by this stage. And this is my list. This isn't by no means exhaustive, and it doesn't mean that everyone else should go out and do this. But simple things like airports, maritime ports, hotels, as I've spoken about, roads, the pervasiveness of universal language, whether it be English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, or whatever the base communication or historical has been. These all need to be evaluated and prioritised in accordance with your own operations. These are just both some of the suggestions, but the things that are my go-to list of things that I can go, okay, well, these are the 5, 6, 12 things that I know and have detailed information and assessment on in these locations. This is how I compare it with others. So it helps prioritise, it helps communicate, and it helps people make better and faster references as they transition, or they communicate, or they govern multiple locations. The sentiment and ignorance, now look, I put that in there in terms of, again, how popular is security, how popular are you, how popular is change. Are you going against the grain? Again, it's good to get a baseline understanding, or have a social sentiment, or even a basic understanding of people's awareness. People can be aware that there is a shark risk or a drowning risk, but equally they can ignore simple things like wearing seatbelts or airbags or wearing a helmet with motorbikes. These sorts of things are all around us, and they're often very good for establishing baseline sort of sentiment or social practices and acceptance. Let's talk about some of the major issues, and I've already covered most of these anyway, and that is operating within silos. That is, not communicating across business models, not making comparative linkages between environments and understanding, and certainly from a security perspective, having competing agendas between cyber security and physical security and investigations, it's not going to work. Ultimately, one will win, others will wither on the vine, but equally you're going to have competing agendas and they're going to evolve at different rates. You need to make these bridges, you need to have an enterprise risk management approach, you need a universal umbrella approach, not a bunch of little kingdoms and fiefdoms and one market or one location is higher or lower. Marketing, again, this comes back to your messaging and communications. How well can you communicate? How do you communicate? Do you have hard, soft, hot and cold communication factors? Are these things hardwired? Are you really trying to change people's belief? So do you have to do it frequent and in smaller steps, or do you just give them the truth straight up and try and hope that it plays out in your benefit or the organisation's benefit, which should be a shared valued system, by the way. Emergencies, again, how the response, how is this an automated system? Is this a bureaucratic machine process that says, well, if there's a fire, people will respond in this manner, it's your procedures, it's trialed, it's tested, it becomes routine? What is in place, what needs to be in place, and how universal is this? Because unfortunately, it's those first 3 minutes, that first 60 minutes, that can really determine the outcome of an incident, certainly an event, or what then escalates to either a business continuity or crisis management disruption event, and then becomes a priority for recovery and containment. News and mass media. Look, fake news is probably the best way to sum it up. What's fact? What is fictional? How do you get the best message through? Or are you firefighting and chasing yourself around and your people because some other rumour comes out that you have to address, and perception and ignorance management is really what you're doing most of your time. This kind of ties into the Dr. Google effect, whereby people will Google for their own results. And if they don't believe you, or they want to second guess, or they want to check, they'll go to a search engine and they'll type that in. What are they going to find? How authoritative is that? Have you preempted that? Is your technical advice more qualitative? Is it more sophisticated? Or are they just going to go, well, I've looked on Google and there's 3 other options and this is what I'm going to do? So consider it, because it affects everyone. It's not just the medical industry whereby, I've got a cough, I've got a sore knee, I'm going to Google my results, and you could get everything from a blogger to a child's response. How qualitative are those responses? Or are you a respected and accepted authority on most matters? And this plays to sort of terms of reference. If people can't find it, they will either make up their own terms of reference. If it's a patriarchal or monarchist sort of society, they will listen to their brother, their cousin, their father, their auntie, their mother. What are their terms of reference? And is your process or is your requirement influencing or changing the terms of reference, or are you trying to hold yourself and the organisation to either a superior or foreign terms of reference? Do you first need to educate people and say, well, you know what, this body of knowledge is taken from science and evidence, and this is how it was gained, before you simply tell people follow the rule book because we're management? Again, good luck with that. Now, risk. This is an essential element that individuals and organisations really need to deep dive into. So you've got perception of risk, which is a physical response, whether it be sight, sound, whether it be sort of the emotive factors. And then you've got cognitive risk, which is your perception and understanding. Is it pure risk? Is it speculative risk? Is your evaluation of risk based on probabilistic factors? Is it based on research? Is it something outdated? Is it something you've inherited? Your evaluation of threat and consideration, particularly in societies where pure risk is real, whether it be snake bites, shark attacks, tsunamis, as opposed to a more managed or contrived environment where you have none of those factors. So when you transition people and organisations from one to another, if they're simply not aware that snake bites kill thousands of people, then they're simply not looking out for snakes. And vice versa, if you take someone into an environment with high technology and traffic and so on, they could equally get run over by a car because they look in the wrong direction, because cars drive on the wrong side of the road in their perception. Appetite and self-evaluation, I've kind of touched on this on a bit of a tangent or in part, is that this plays into people's acceptance of risk and people's ability to recall things. And their appetite for risk, or what they believe to be a risk. People who jump out of planes will tell you that, it's far less risky than, driving in some countries. Because they've trained, they've educated, they're prepared, and they've got control measures in place. But again, not everybody's the same. We don't share the same worldview. We don't share the same risk appetite. You need to be both accommodating and considerate and evaluative of all of those various verticals, because you as an individual could be making decisions on behalf of others that could affect them, and they may simply reject it or not understand it. And that plays into things like living memory. Humans don't have a very good recall system and filing cabinet, and they apportion things for different reasons. So therefore you may need to remind them of certain things. You may need to use a combination of visuals and stories and processes that break through a lot of the corporate and mass media communications, because everybody's getting a million messages. It doesn't matter where you are in the world. And therefore they don't necessarily remember things, and certainly don't take it for granted that they're going to recall or remember if it's obscure, unique, or specific to just security. This ties into aviation security. Is it theatre? Is it practical? Does it work? How efficient is it? Lots of people have opinions on it, and unfortunately it's one of those elements that people form a lot of opinion on security based on the security they see every day. So whether it's aviation security, whether it's bank security, whether it's shopping mall security, they typically don't make distinctions between it. It's bundled into one catch-all phrase, and it can both enhance and tarnish everybody's thinking and methodologies, if it's either poor, perceived to be poor, or there's just a lot of information online about it, and most of it being negative. The integration factors, making all of this work, and it's complex, and it's organisational learning, it's tiered approaches, it's change management, it's individuals, it's departmental, it's all these sorts of things that need to be considered. and need to be practical and measured, and they may all work simultaneously. You may have to break this down into like a Gantt chart and have specific milestones for specific objectives, because simply trying to boil the ocean and doing everything at once, again, in my experience, doesn't work. Now, just touching on practitioners, there are appointed and there are qualified. And what I mean by this is you may have security title and you may have somebody in your organisation that is deemed a security person. Doesn't make them qualified. And qualified in itself is a very subjective term, unfortunately. Qualified through experience. Are you former military police? Well, that's not a qualification. Do you have academic credentials? Have you been schooled in particular practices? Do you have advanced academic standing in some of these? Is it commensurate with the business organisation, or are you surrounded by people with far superior qualifications and understanding of their trade as opposed to your own? And this is one of the essential and definitive elements of our industry, and certainly security risk management, is the fight for what is accepted and qualified as opposed to just appointed. Because HR managers and selection process is not the qualitative curation of our industry. And that is what somebody decided someone was capable of. They put them in the role. That appointment means next to nothing, unfortunately. Time cycles. Consider things both short-term, immediate, and long-term. These are some of the goals that you need to break down your objectives. Are you going to get results in 2 days, 3 days, 5 days, 6 months, 6 years? You need to make them clear and you need to communicate them, because in a transnational, international environment, everything's going to be out of sync, or you're going to have to deputise people and have them invested in the process. One person, one department, and one company can't get all of this done. It's about a shared vision. It's about a shared responsibility. How do you delineate from that? How do you invest in it? How do you prepare people? Break it down into small size pieces, and make sure that the objective and the horizon is still visible to people, even though they may be working on the more immediate task-dependent or even response mechanism, but they all need to be swimming in the right direction. So again, very briefly, and for everybody listening, you should have a lot of things for both consideration, a lot of things inclusive, and certainly a lot of elements that I want you to go away and look into yourself. If I've mentioned processes here, you can come back and ask me. You can follow up at the end of this training session, but most importantly, invest in your understanding. Invest in seeking out the information, qualifying that. It's called double loop learning. Single loop learning is here it is, apply it, don't question it. Double loop learning is, well, hang on, is what you're telling me in the right context? Should I be doing that in this particular manner? It's often described as the difference between a thermostat. Is the thermostat in a single loop learning is, the thermostat's broken, find a solution to fix the thermostat. In a double loop learning, it's like, well, hang on, should we even be using a thermostat? Is it set at the right temperature? Have we considered other options? And that's what I want everyone to do, because in a transnational and multinational environment, the rules change every day. Societies change, community change, sentiment changes, the message changes. Infrastructure changes, and you over time should also be changing and adapting and evolving over time. I'm not the person I was 6 months ago. I'm not the person I was 6 years ago. And everybody in the security industry needs to be exactly the same. We all need to carry a high degree of humility, and we need to accept that, sometimes we are practitioners. We try things that don't work, or we make information based on the best available information at the time. When the information and the facts change, so too should you. Spoken about influence, major issues, and also the results and how you move towards those results. And I haven't given you a cookbook solution and told you exactly what to do, because the rules and the equation changes. You need to work out what the equation is before you focus on the results. Well, that hopefully for everybody is a very information dense process, an educational process. I encourage you to go back over this. I believe you'll be getting a copy of the recording. If anybody's got any questions for both specific addressing here and now, you can put into the chat box, into the question box, and we can go over those. Alternatively, you can track me down, send me an email, find me on LinkedIn, or follow up through the organisers of the education session, and they can put you in contact, or we can have a consolidated learning outcome. But in short, thank you all very much. Greatly appreciated for your time, and I'm going to conclude now. And once again, thank you very much. And today's topic has been on transnational, multinational, international security. I'm Tony Ridley, International Security and Risk Management Professional. These are some of the things that I've done in this area, and why I've been asked to speak on these issues, and how I hope many of you can learn from my own experiences and my own experimentation, practices, and certainly education. That's all for now. Thank you very much. Goodbye.